and round we go. Patrick, good morning to you.
Good morning. Just getting in touch. Just as a bit of a heads up, I work for Minerals West Coast, which is a mining industry association, so it is my job to talk things up. But,
Right.
just in case there any conflict there. But it's funny. These debates have been going on for decades, if not longer. If you look back through the annals of history and press coverage and things like that, and it never fails to be something that's incredibly polarising. And as you and some of your callers have sort of noted over the past hour, is that it always seems to sort of hit this wall of either you're some sort of nostalgic who wants to return to a lost Eden in a simpler time before the Industrial Revolution or before agriculture even, or you're some sort of brash developer that just wants to march boldly ahead into a brave new world or something like that. And as you sort of noted as well, in addition to that one, there's also you're either a greedy capitalist that just wants to accumulate and foster as much wealth as you can and bugger the birds and the trees and everything else as you go, or you're some sort of, the hypocrisy stick, it's very tempting to hit people with it. And I think while it's easy to dismiss in instances the logical consistency of some of the placards and platitudes, there are environmental issues that have occurred as humans have increased their living standards over the past, centuries and millennia. But it's incredibly hard to sort of get off this train now that we're on it, so to speak. I mean, even if you go back before modern humans were even modern humans, so Homo sapiens, which is what we are, have been around for a couple of 100,000 years. But it was actually our ancestors, Homo habilis, about 2.5 million years ago, as far as the records show, that first started picking up rocks and thinking, jeepers, these can actually be used for quite useful things, like cutting up animal hides and, crushing something if you had to. And I guess over time, people thought, I wonder what other rocks are around. And if they're above the ground, they're possibly below the ground. And, and here we are. But I do think there are things that are simultaneously true at the same time, and I think trying to find a middle ground between the two is really the best way to go, because there are environmental issues, there is loss of species, fossil fuels are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are warming the planet, and that's something to be concerned about. But it's also true that for lifting and then maintaining a higher standard of living for both people who've already got a decent standard of living, like you and I do, as we're lucky enough to live in New Zealand, or people in poorer countries who don't really like being poor. But trying to do that at the same time as looking after the environment, I'm not convinced that middle ground can't be found somewhere, but it just gets lost in a lot of the shouting and the sign waving a lot of the time.
I think there has never been a worse time to try and find middle ground on anything. We have become so polarised and so tribal. Like, even if you thought that perhaps you wouldn't want to see any diminution in your loss of in your standard of living, if you hated National, you wouldn't care. You'd still be out there in the protests.
Well, that's the thing, and I mean that I think one question that you've asked, or possibly others have raised this morning, is what is the alternative? And there are other ways of economically organising. I do think a market economy and a democracy is a pretty good way of running a society, and that's not without its environmental issues or other human issues. But at the same time, a centrally planned communist economy, there were experiments with that in the 20th century. They weren't a roaring success, but one phrase that's starting to come up as well, and sort of on the idea of the lost Eden, as I mentioned earlier, is that, well, we just need to live with less. Our lifestyles become too extreme. And there was a book I read over the Christmas break called Commune by a woman called Olive Jones. It's worth getting a copy of and reading, actually. And sort of the latter half of the 20th century, I guess, in New Zealand and around the world, there were, and she did note, people from largely sort of Pākehā, middle-class families that were a bit wistful and wanted to see if there was possibly a way of returning to a simpler time. The fact that those communes sort of sprung up, they existed for a decade or two, and then they petered out, kind of tells you that that's not a strong vote of confidence in that way of living, and that whether we like it or not, people don't really like going out and hunting for their food in the forest or tilling the fields. Some do, and they continue to do to this day, but that's the minority of the planet's population.
It's an incredible minority, and possibly on the West Coast, you see some of those families who do go, I've seen them in the far north. They get away from everything. They don't take benefits. They don't take advantage of the education system or the health system. They do it themselves, and it is a lifelong basically existence, where it's a completely different way of life and one they've chosen and one that's authentic. But it's bloody hard work.
Oh, it's incredibly hard work, but the idea of the sort of romanticising the person that, goes for the simpler life. I mean, I guess that's why Barry Crump's A Good Keen Man was such a successful book, right? Because people like to romanticise the idea of someone who lives out in the back blocks, or in a modern time you've got Beansprout living down at Gord River. But if 5 million New Zealanders decided to descend into the conservation estate and try and eke their existence out there, I think that would not have very good outcomes for the environment either. And again, I sort of called up to say that we shouldn't really go to the extremes, but it's always tempting to take the arguments to this. But if you look, I mean, realistically, it's very difficult to say that we can do without minerals, including fossil fuels, for the foreseeable future. But one thing that sort of people get hung up on is you can take a supply-side solution, which is to say the production of these materials is so harmful, so destructive and unnecessary that they ought not be produced anymore, and we'll just ban their production. And those sorts of methods or measures have been taken with things like ivory and asbestos and other things like that. But most of the fossil fuel that New Zealand consumes isn't actually produced domestically. It's imported. And I don't say that with regard to coal. I say that with regard to the oil that comes in and diesel and petrol and things like that. It comes from, I presume, largely the Middle East and other parts of the world, goes to refineries in Singapore and then comes to New Zealand. And even when the Marsden Point refinery was open, as you noted, there was that was using imported crude oil. And there are countries around the world, like the East Asian sort of tigers, if you like, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, that have next to no domestic fossil fuel production, but they import everything they need. So turning off the tap domestically doesn't mean people won't source it from offshore, because we live in a global economy. And so we're still going to be using those materials. We've got the ability to import them anyway. But the other aspect of it as well is that, as I think a texter or a caller noted earlier, countries like Norway and Australia have got a phenomenally high standard of living, and all the data would indicate that comes from the fact that they've got this massively capital-intensive, highly paying resources sector. And, we may never be a Brunei or a Saudi Arabia or a Norway or even in Australia, but there are opportunities in this country in minerals and petroleum that at the moment are not being made the most of. And when you dilute it at a national level, even if mining was to go from 1 to 2 or 3% of GDP, that's obviously going to be a huge increase. But at a regional level, if you look at places like Taranaki or the West Coast or Coromandel or Otago, that's hundreds or thousands of more high-paying jobs that otherwise wouldn't be here. And I think almost every New Zealander will have a friend or a family member or someone they know that's gone off to Australia in pursuit of a better life. And for me, I would just like to see more of those opportunities here in New Zealand. And again, to sort of come back to where we sort of started, I understand the concerns that these protesters have got, and they're not entirely invalid, but if we could just stop shouting at each other, I feel like we might actually be able to figure something out.
I don't think it's going to happen for a few more years yet. Look, it was a breath of fresh air to hear you try and find middle ground and acknowledge the protesters. It really was, because we're so used to shouting at one another. But whoa, I don't know. I don't know that we're going to do it, but I applaud you for trying. Even the Greens say mining should only occur where it's essential for upholding. So, they haven't said they'll do away with it altogether. Somebody says, oh, very nice to hear Patrick Phelps on the radio. He identified himself straight away as saying working for Minerals West Coast, and saying, he's got an interest in the promotion of mining, but also understands the concerns of the protesters. So there we go. More of that. NewstalkZB 1020.